Welcome back, everybody, to the Football Room here, brought to you by A to Z Sports. Ryan Roberts, college football and NFL draft analyst at A to Z Sports. My second time on the show as now the permanent co-host along with James Foster. Unfortunately, folks, James is a little bit under the weather. He's all good. He'll be back up and at it very soon here, but I didn't want to miss a week because note to self and everybody out there that follows this channel on YouTube or any other podcast platform, I'm going to be in Scotland next week. So there's not going to be a show that's going to be dropping next week, but I wanted to make sure you guys had some nice content coming. So I got myself a co-host for a day, but a co-host that I am very, very familiar with. Honestly, I felt like to myself, I could go get a nice interview with a person, or I could find this random person that maybe I've never talked to on a podcast, but why not get one of the best co-hosts? Because I can't say the best co-host anymore. Nice. Joseph, I can't do it, man. I can't do it now that I'm on the Football Room. But my good friend and longtime partner on the First Team NFL Draft and College Football Podcast, I got Joe DeLeone, also the host of Ruffino and Joe Show. If you follow that on any and all of your favorite podcast platforms, we are going to talk underrated underrated 2025 NFL draft prospects that we are a little bit higher on. We're also going to talk a little bit about some college football hot takes. Joseph, welcome to the Football Room, my friend.
I thought you were going to lead me in by saying I could have gone and got somebody bigger, but here we are talking to Joe again. I have to point this out, by the way, before we get into this.
Yes.
For the entirety of the time that I've known you, which I think is almost 5 years now, and we've been working together for a long time.
It's got to be at least 5 years.
You have been on my shows a number of times. I have never, ever been on one of your shows. That occurred to me yesterday when we were coordinating this. I have never guested on a show that you host that I am not a part of.
I mean, have I really had another show that I have been a co-host?
Irish Breakdown, technically.
Yeah. I mean, you don't know anything about Notre Dame, though. So what was I going to do about that?
You stink. Get on to the topics. I
just
had to point that out. I thought that was very funny for how long we've worked together. I have technically never been your guest. You have been my guest plenty of times.
Well, that's fair. But now that the Football Room is a thing here at A to Z Sports, maybe you'll get an invite back. I don't know. We'll see how you do today. I'm grading you as we go. So
don't have high hopes, folks.
If anybody hasn't caught any of the content that me and Joe do together, we talk a lot of NFL draft prospects. We talk a little bit of college football on the First Team, but mostly Joe keeps that for Ruffino and Joe. So I'm going to get, for the first time, we're going to go back and forth a little bit on some college football 2024 topics that could be a little bit controversial. That's why we're calling them hot takes. But I know everybody here likes the scouting side of the business, and obviously as NFL draft analysts, that's what we love to bring to the table as well. So, Joe, we each are bringing to the table 3 2025 NFL draft prospects that we have deemed as players that, as of today, in the month of August, the year 2024, for the 2025 NFL draft, that we are higher on seemingly than the consensus, at least the mainstream consensus. So, you as the guest, I'm going to let you start, man. Give me your first player that you would say, as of today, you are higher on than the majority of the consensus out there in NFL draft universe.
Yeah, the first one that came to mind was Patrick Payton from Florida State, because I've listened to a number of other shows. I've seen a number of other positional rankings. Everybody's really high on Mykel Williams right now, who is the Georgia edge rusher, which is justified. His traits are phenomenal. He's very powerful. He's just has a really nice raw profile that you can continue to build on. And he could have a huge year this year. There is a huge potential for him to rise and end up being this first overall pick. But Patrick Payton, it surprises me that we don't talk about him, and at least in a similar light of that of Mykel Williams. I don't think that Patrick Payton could be a riser to the point where he is a first overall pick like Williams. But his tools, his length, his athleticism, and the power that he has for being one of the leanest edge rushers at the top of this class, it's really surprising that he's not getting as much love. I understand where the big issue comes into play, where he is a bit underweight, but for him to be deemed by a lot of people as a late first rounder or maybe even a day 2 guy, I think he's much better than that. I think his impact is very notable for Florida State, and his production is only going to go up now that Jared Verse has moved on and he's going to be paired up with Marvin Jones Jr.
So here's the thing about Patrick Payton, so for people that haven't watched him yet, he is the defensive end for Florida State, number 11, was finished the 2023 season a part of that really good Seminole defense with 44 total tackles, 14 and a half tackles for loss, 7 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and Joe, 10 pass breakups. That's a wild number with
He's
that.
got long ass arms.
No,
just to put it very simply, he has got some ridiculously long arms.
He does, man. He does. He's how you draw it up from a just length body type perspective. Obviously, he needs to continue to add weight to his profile. I mean, he's listed at 250 right now. We'll see if that's a legit 250 this fall when he gets back on the field. But I do see a lot of parallels to Josh Sweat that came out of Florida State a few years ago. It's been a pretty good player for the Philadelphia Eagles. I mean, he had a 10 plus sack season in the 2022 year. So there's a lot of parallels, I think, there. Here's the thing that I have to question, though, and I would love to hear if you agree, because I agree with you in a vacuum that sometimes when a player who is highly productive leaves a team, that means that more production is on the table for a player. But I would also argue this, is that Patrick Payton did get a lot of one-on-one matchups in 2023 because there was so much attention on Jared Verse. There was so much attention on Braden Fisk. Like, there were a couple studs in that group. I mean, one guy that went top 20, one guy that went top 40 to the LA Rams in the top of the second round in Braden Fisk. My question for you would be, are you worried that now that Patrick Payton is the guy, quote unquote, that's going to maybe have to deal with some chips at times, maybe a tight end stays in the block, you give extra help, you slide protection to him. Are you worried about the power profile that Patrick Payton brings to the table?
Well, I think that my argument against that is now we're going to have on film knowing how he's going to handle that he's not going to be getting these one-on-one situations. Again, I'm not worried about the power profile. It all comes down to his weight. I don't think he's a weak player. I think that he's a lot stronger than you would expect. He holds the line of scrimmage. I know the length comes into play here, and that helps him a lot, but he holds the line of scrimmage, I think, a lot better than people are willing to give him credit for. I think because you see how light he is, you're immediately going to assume, hey, this guy's not going to be very strong. And if he does get moved off the ball, if he does get stymied by a stronger offensive tackle, it is because he is so far on the lighter side. I don't know what he's going to weigh at the start of this season. I would bet by the end of the draft process, he's going to be much heavier. It's always something that I come back to, that when you start your pre-draft training, you sit down with the trainers, you sit down with the nutritionists, they talk to you and say, okay, you've done a great job of building up to this point. We want you to show up for your workouts at this weight, at this body composition. We want you to look like this. That extra attention to detail, I think that I want to say he's at 240 right now. I think he could get up to like 250, 255, and 240 was probably a generous number that was given to him.
Yeah, so on the roster, I looked yesterday, he was actually listed at 250 now. So hopefully, I mean, he's more in that ballpark now. You know, like I never really worry about weight as long as the frame is projectable, because I mean, we did this with
That's
Brian
where
Burns
I'm coming from.
ago,
That's exactly where I'm coming from, is that for him to have this baseline and him to be so underweight for an edge rusher, that's where the projectability is. That's where I see, okay, this kid has a really great ceiling. I can see what needs to be worked on compared to maybe some, the thing I would say with Michael Williams, he needs more technical refinement, but there's nothing to change on his frame. He's already filled out. Yeah.
That's absolutely correct. And I was going to say is that, we did this with Brian Burns a few years ago, right?
Yeah.
And Brian Burns showed up to the combine at 250 plus, and we haven't heard a word about weight with Brian Burns since he entered the NFL. I think it's a similar thing with James Pierce Jr. from Tennessee this year. It's like, hey, he's listed at 240 something now. He probably played in the high 220s last year, maybe 230. He has a frame, though, that I look at and say he can hold 245, 250. So I'm not overly worried about it. I am interested to see what the perspective is on a guy like Patrick Payton kind of moving forward, because he is a guy that has, for whatever reason, flown under the radar a little bit, despite decent production, despite the physical profile that you usually like on the edge. So we'll see. My first guy, Joe, a guy that we literally just talked about on the mock draft episode that I put in the first round of my first mock draft for the 2025 NFL draft, Kaden Prather, wide receiver from Maryland, has a lot of day 2 grades around the NFL, but I put him in the late first round conversation. I think I gave him number 30 to the Baltimore Ravens in my recent mock. 6'4" verified, 211 pounds. Funny enough, former West Virginia wide receiver who was pretty productive in 2022, but then he went to 2023 and he took it up a notch. I think the reason that we're not talking about Kaden Prather, who I project as a 6'4", 211 guy that's probably going to run high 4.4, is that they had a lot of mouths to feed last year, man. I know you liked Ty Felton, the other wide receiver.
Yeah.
Funny enough, their leading receiver was Jashawn Jones, who's no longer on the team as well. So they had 3 mouths to feed, not even counting the tight end, Corey Dyches, not even counting Roman Hemby, who's a good all-purpose back that's returning for the 2023 season as well. I just think that the production has not necessarily been to the level that's going to pop off the tape. Because right now, I mean, last year, 42 catches, 666 yards and 5 touchdowns. I mean, that's 16 yards a catch. That's a great number for a 6'4" guy. But I just think this is the year, Joe, that if the production follows a little bit, we're going to be talking about Kaden Prather as a massive riser for the 2025 class.
Yeah, I'm watching receivers this week. This is when I'm going to knock out my receivers. I still haven't watched him, so I need to get the full scope of things. I had mentioned to you when we were texting about him, because you asked if I had recommended him when we were doing in-season scouting for RPM, if he had caught my attention. And I wrote him down very briefly. I wrote his teammate down as well. There are some bodies. It's something that's it's almost a gag that Maryland has these really highly coveted athletes that are just so rare, but most of them don't live up to the expectation. It's almost, or not so much live up to the expectation. A lot of times they're not developed and they don't produce statistically. It's like Penn State, where they have all these blue chippers on defense, and then most of them develop halfway across and then don't ever really get to their full potential. But I got to watch him. I know that you're a big fan of his.
Well, you know what's funny enough is I remember one thing that gave you pause about Kalen King this past year was I remember you said that he had a tough game against Maryland, and you're just like, kind of like, I don't know, any of these receivers from Maryland really, but like they're giving him a tough time. And now that you bring that up, now did you watch the Penn State game? Now I'm remembering some of these plays with this kid, because I literally, we had this text conversation where I said, this taller receiver kicked his ass. That's okay. Now I know who we're talking about here. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, so number 1, and then you mentioned again, Felton, the other wide receiver, I think is number 10. Number 10. So yeah, I mean, Maryland's got some receivers coming back. Look, I don't think Talia Tungavailoa was very good. I don't really like the offensive structure that Mike Locksley has in Maryland's, but like if they could figure it out for 1 year, Joe, just like one season, figure it out. The passing offense could be explosive, man. It really could be, but I think they have a quarterback competition. I think they have a quarterback competition between Billy Edwards, who was already there, and then I feel like they got a transfer. Maybe they got a transfer.
I'm going to tell you right now. MJ. Oh, they brought in MJ Morris. No, MJ Morris is going to start. State. Yeah, that kid's going to start. He's a pretty good player.
He's a good athlete. I don't know if he's going to unlock the passing game with his passing prowess, but I hope so, because the running back Roman Hemby's not a bad player either, man. Like if they can just get a quarterback and a just good offensive play caller, they could be a team that makes a little bit of noise offensively at least. But we'll see if that happens. Number 2 for you, sir, player that you're a little higher on the consensus.
The second one that I had, and this is less of a sleeper than it was originally, because Connor Rogers is a big fan of his, and he came on our show and told us about him. Kyle Manango from Rutgers is somebody that I keep banging the table for. I feel like throughout this process, and even after the season, if he has a good season, he's still going to get pushed outside of most guys' top 10 running backs. I understand that he is not the same long speed type of an athlete as some of these other running backs, but he just does all of the dirty work and checks so many of the boxes, enough for him to be a team's really good second running back. He is the type of guy that we'll look up in 10 years into his career, 8 years into his career, and we're going to be saying, Kyle Manango is still playing? Oh, my team signed Kyle Manango. He's on my team right now. He just is not only going to be someone who can pick up those dirty yards because he's got great vision, he's great in between the tackles, he's going to fight for just anything that is going to be given to him, but he's awesome as a pass blocker. He is very aggressive as a pass blocker, and he's not afraid to hit as a lead blocker as well if he wants to, despite only being 5'8" and that maxed out
5'9",
frame he has.
5'9" verified.
5'9".
Don't cut my guys short. Don't cut my guys short, man.
Sorry.
5'9", 210 verified.
I just love running backs who have this mentality, and he reminds me a ton of Kyren Williams. I think that he could have an impact similar to Kyren Williams if he lands in a situation maybe like the Rams. He could be a team's lead back and put up some pretty good production.
Dude, I hate running backs projecting them sometimes, man, because it's so
because it's hit or miss. It's because if a team might not see his usage the same way that another team might.
Right. Well, and it's just so overly dictated by situation that you fall into, right? I mean, every year there's a James Robinson or Elijah Mitchell or Kyren Williams, and in most of those cases, the guys do flame out after a couple years just because they're good in that situation for a short period, but then it's like, hey, but are they as good as you still need them to be in other facets? I think Kyren Williams is the great example because he brings that profile of really good pass blocker, can catch the football in the backfield, which will probably allow him to sustain his success a little bit more. But I do think that Kyle Manango, dude, it is a pleasure to watch that young man run the football. I mean, and I say that with the most utter, like I really enjoy watching him, right? Like there's an admiration to him because ultimately there's some players that you like, there's some players you love, there's some players you don't like that much, but then there's other players that are generally a joy to watch play football. And I do think that is Kyle Manango. Number 2, Joe, running back. So I like that you start this little transition into another running back for me. Okay. I got Jakori Krossmer, who is a running back at the University of Arizona. What'd you say?
Deep pull, man. I'm bringing all these my third one is really lame because of how big of a name it is. You could probably guess who it is based on the show that we just taped. But all right, go ahead. Go. I another guy that I have not watched because he is so deep down the list of guys that you have gone. Yes, it is. It absolutely is deep.
He's a Big Ten running back, sir. He's a Big Ten running back for the University of Arizona. Actually, a Big 12 running back.
Big 12. I was going to say.
Big 12.
Confused
Big 12,
me there for a second. All right, go ahead.
Jakori Krossmer, who actually started his career at Alabama State, was at Alabama State, went to New Mexico this past year for New Mexico. I don't know how many people were watching. Is that Mountain West? Are they still Mountain West? I'm going to assume they're Mountain West. 1,190 yards and 17 touchdowns, Joe. He averaged 6.3 yards per carry. He had some crazy games too, man. Fresno State, 21 carries. 209 yards was his best game this past year. But then against Utah State, who was a decent football team last year, like they weren't bad at all. He had 31 carries for 233 yards in that final football game for New Mexico. Transferred this offseason. So it was a very weird transfer designation for Jakori Krossmer, who is listed 5'11", 204 pounds. I'll get into what I like about his game in a second. But he transferred to Arizona. Then he re-entered the portal, was going to go to Ole Miss, and then he flipped again to Arizona. So Arizona, Ole Miss, Arizona in the transfer portal this offseason. And I really like the fit with Arizona, man. Jonah Coleman went up to Washington this offseason, who I think is a really good running back as well. Arizona needed a lead back, and I think Jakori Krossmer, a guy that most people aren't going to know, brings a lot of things to the table that I really like, man. Really good vision, very explosive, and incredible feel for the space on the second and third levels. Kind of one of those guys that seemingly has eyes in the back of his head at times because he just understands where to move in space at an incredible rate. So Jakori Krossmer, for anybody out there that's a Big 12 fan, wants a little bit of a lower sleeper in the 2025 class at running back, I think he's going to do a lot of good things for the Arizona Wildcats in 2024.
Yeah, again, I haven't gotten eyes on him, but he's highly sought after enough that it sounds like that there's reason to have optimism he could burst onto the scene.
Ole Miss wanted him, man. And I'm actually...
Well, they went after a million running backs. That's the only thing they did.
Well, I mean, they landed him, though, right? Like, he was literally committed to Ole Miss. So, I mean, after Logan Diggs left, right? I guess they had that. Actually, Logan Diggs is at Ole Miss now, right? He was at LSU. Now he's at Ole Miss. But, yeah, either way, he is going to be there. Number 3 for you? Is this 3 that's coming up?
Yes, number 3. I was gonna bring up Travis Hunter, but I'm not gonna do that.
Travis Hunter, a guy that you're higher on than everyone. He's in top 10 of every mock draft.
Here was my very quick reasoning why he was the first guy I wrote down, because I was thinking about how when I published that, you and I talked about it, and a lot of people when I posted my rankings on Twitter were kind of dumbfounded that I had him number 1 over Will Johnson at my corner ranking.
I
So I'm not
actually
going to do
saw
that.
I felt bad because I saw your ranking that you posted, and I don't think you had any likes yet, but you just had like a few people disagree with you in the chat. I'm just like, oh,
I don't
man.
care. I mean, I don't care. I wanted to have that conversation, but I'm not going to do it. You went with some deep polls. I'm going to give this is not really a deep poll because he's coming from a big program, but one guy who I've not seen his name really listed anywhere, and Jemal Otis from Alabama, the defensive tackle, was more rotational last year, and I think that he's now going to be called upon to play a lot more. He's really flexible, and he generates some really easy power. You can tell that he is a bit inexperienced, but if we're going to highlight DeMonte Capehart, who the NFL really likes, as this less experienced guy who was very rotated in very heavily last year on a deep defensive line, who is expected to maybe be an early day 2 pick, I think Jemal Otis belongs in the same conversation. He's got some crazy plays on film where he just looks super, super fluid for how massive he is.
I was actually trying to look up the measurements on him because he blocks out the sun, man. Like, he's a big dude. Alabama always has those guys. It was just like, where do they find this dude? Where is Otis? Oh, here's Otis. So Otis, actually not as big as I thought he was. 6'3" and 6'8".
He was listed at 6'5" on their website.
321 pounds. So I mean, he's still a big dude. He's still big. But, yeah. For some reason, I thought he was like 340 plus just by his name. But either way, he's massive. So Joe, I just did back-to-back people that you haven't watched so far. I have not watched Jemal Otis still.
I remember that when we did our defensive tackle show because you didn't have anything on him.
Man, I feel like Alabama hasn't had a dude inside in a couple years either. So I'm interested to see if anyone takes that ascension, because they also have Tim Smith, I think, is a guy that's coming back as well. I mean, because for a few years there, man, they had Marcel Darius is a little aged out at this point, but they even had Quinnen Williams. They've had some guys over the last few years, to say the least. But what's the guy? Oh, man, I'm losing my train of thought. But who's the guy with the Patriots right now that's really good for them on the interior? What's his name?
Oh, Jesus.
I know, dude. I had a high grade on him too, but for some reason it's not.
What? Wait, give me a second. Who's your guy though? I'm gonna look this up. This is gonna.
I'm gonna find it. I'm gonna find it right now. The answer is Christian Barmore. Christian Barmore is the answer.
Two guys who are supposed to know a bunch of names. Jesus.
I know. Well, I mean, dude, we just threw out Jakori Krossmer merit, so I think we're okay on the knowing names conversation here. But either way, last guy, Joe. Last guy, and then we're gonna get into some college football hot takes. This guy, who I have not talked to you about. Well, actually, no, I did talk to you about him because I literally texted you about him. I know you've seen this guy. Daniel Jackson, man, wide receiver from Minnesota.
I put you on to him. He's He's another guy that I've put you on to. He had that ridiculous catch in week 1, and then nobody talked about him again. He moves, man. He can fly upfield. He can really uncover on some of his deep routes, and he's got really good hands. I need to. I'm going to make sure that he is in my receiving group of guys that I watch before we do our receiver show. But I was blown away. He does some really good stuff, and nobody talks about him at all.
And he has a lot of 4th round grades from the NFL. Yeah. So we're not talking about a dude that's going to go undrafted here. We're talking about a legitimately draftable, probably mid-round, maybe top 100 wide receiver. I don't think it's out of the question.
He'll test well too.
I think so. 6 foot, 200 pounds listed. So he's probably 5'11", some change, 195 pounds, somewhere in that ballpark. He's got okay size, but he does most of his work from the slot anyway. So I'm not worried about the size profile at all. He had 59 receptions for 831 yards and 8 touchdowns, Joe. That's good production. But when you add in the fact of how terrible Minnesota's passing offense was last year, it's excellent production when you put it into context, in my opinion. My favorite thing about him, though, because I agree, I think he's functionally a pretty good athlete all around, okay? I love this kid as a route runner, though, man. That was the thing that flashed to me the most. I think this is an early starting receiver on the NFL level in the slot. He reminds me a lot of, and I'm not comparing his production-wise on the next level to Amon-Ra St. Brown, but there is a lot of Amon-Ra St. Brown style to this player. Really smooth, maybe more explosive than he is fast overall, kind of gets to top gear quick, but man, he understands how to find blind spots in coverage. He understands how to settle down in zone, and he understands how to run routes. I think this kid could be a high volume player on the NFL level, probably a nice second to third option his first year or two in the NFL, but I would not be shocked. And I'm here to put the slight hot take out there. If this is a player that is a number one overall or number one receiver for a football team down the line in the NFL, I would not be shocked at all with Daniel Jackson.
And I know that does seem hyperbolic, but him reaching that Amon-Ra St. Brown level of production is totally doable. He's a guy that checks every single box, but he's playing in an offense very similar to Deion Burks, playing in an offense with a quarterback that isn't great at consistently delivering him the football where it needs to be for him to make good plays. He still manages to succeed and make ridiculous catches, and despite the ball not being in a consistent catch radius, still finds ways to corral it. But the other part too is Purdue and Minnesota didn't throw the ball a ton and didn't throw it a ton successfully. They leaned on their ground games. So there's just not as many targets. But when you get the small sample size and you put together enough games, you watch both of these guys and you just think to yourself, all of these things translate to the NFL. All of these things are things that I look for in a type of a role, and he could end up being a team's number one option, or at the very least number two option, if the right NFL team plops him right in.
You know what's funny is I mentioned Minnesota, obviously. You mentioned Rutgers with Kyle Manango. Their Minnesota starting quarterback, Ethan Kalakamanis, or whatever the heck his name is
Ethan
McManus. McManus, whatever. That kid has a rifle for an arm.
Why would they go with that kid over Wimsett? Like, what much of a difference does that actually make? I'm not a Rutgers fan for anyone who sees me wearing this shirt. I just have the shirt on. I just realized that.
Dude, he has a cannon for an arm, that kid, but you have no idea where it's going to go at all times. It is bonkers. Let's get into some college football hot takes here, Joseph. Quick transition. I'm going to give mine first because I want to make you mad. Okay, let's get the anger out of you to start this segment off. My first college football hot take for the 2024 season: Clemson wins the ACC is my first hot take, Joseph. I feel like everyone, either you're Miami, I've seen some Florida State people out there, and here's my thing about Clemson and then the other two, okay? Florida State, I think, is going to take a step back this year. Not a step back as in they're 7-5, 8-4, but like 9-3-ish, 10-2-ish, somewhere in that ballpark. You have
to when you go 12-0. It's inevitable to take a step back when you're 12-0 and you put all those guys into the NFL.
Well, and you know how I look at it too, Joe, is that they have hit in the transfer portal each of the last two seasons. I mean, you've gotten Jared Verse, you've gotten Keon Coleman, you've gotten Johnny Wilson. At some point, you're going to have a down transfer portal cycle. Like, it's going to happen at some point. You're not going to hit 100 every single season. So I think Florida State's going to take a slight step back. Still like what Mike Norvell is doing. So I don't think they're going to take a step back to being a below average football team. Like, they'll still be a good team. I just don't think they're going to be a 12-0 college football playoff contending team this year. Just don't believe that. Miami, Joe, look, man, on paper, they are the most talented team in this conference by a landslide. There's no doubt. But anytime that you are not completely, but when you are largely constructed by the transfer portal, there is that slight pause of how is it all going to mesh in one season? Okay, there's that. Two, I don't trust Mario Cristobal. Just don't trust him. I've seen him consistently underachieve with talent during his time at Oregon and now at Miami. I don't trust him. Okay, Clemson, although they are not the Clemson Tigers, the 2015 to 2019, right? Like in that period, this is not the same Clemson team. But I do think that we are underrating how much talent's back on the defense. Year two under Garrett Riley. Year two with Cade Klubnik, a good running back in Phil Maffa coming back, an offensive line that is a veteran-laden unit. I think Clemson could sneakily win 10-plus games this season, and they win the ACC.
So that wraps right into my hot take, so we'll lump these together. I have Miami winning the ACC, and I'm buying all of the hype because I think that, yes, you're bringing in a lot of transfer portal bodies, and there's always a little bit of a risk there. But at the same time, we just saw Florida State do this, and I think that Miami has replicated what is necessary for what Florida State did last year for them to go 12-0 this year. Their offensive line brings back a lot, and there's also guys stepping up like Samson Okunlola who are former 5-star players. Their defensive line had a ton of production last year. Their linebacking unit's pretty good. I know that they're replacing 2 safeties, but I just feel good generally about their defense. Their receiving room is awesome. I think that Xavier Restrepo is going to be really productive this year, and Jacoby
Samuel
George.
Brown, man, from Houston.
Sam Brown, too.
He's good,
so they
dude.
have 3 really good receivers. Yep. I think that when we look at the 2 guys at 2 of the most premier positions at running back and at quarterback, they are a step ahead of every other team in the ACC. If Cam Ward can get into a rhythm, he's never had these types of weapons or this type of an offensive line. He is going to dominate this ACC competition. And more importantly, if they didn't bring in Damian Martinez, maybe I'd have a little bit more pause. But if Cam Ward, which he's bound to do, has a rough stretch of games, they can lean on the run game. Damian Martinez carried Oregon State last year. DJU was unbelievably frustrating to watch last year. And I kept screaming that Oregon State was overrated when some people thought that they were maybe better than people believed because of DJU. So put Damian Martinez in. Cam Ward struggles maybe some games. He can lead the way. I can't get there on Clemson. I agree with you.
You hate Clemson, dude.
They have been there before. I think that Garrett Riley and Cade Klubnik in year 2, the second year is always going to be better than the first because you're more acclimated to one another. Maffa's great, and their defense is always loaded. But who the hell do they have at receiver?
Antonio Williams.
Dude, they didn't have a single guy who had over 600 yards receiving. They didn't have a receiver last year that went over 600 yards receiving. And understandably, there's some younger faces, some young recruits that could step up. But if they get into a situation where you're playing Miami, maybe in the ACC championship game, and you get beat over the top a couple of times and you're down 2 scores and it's at the end of the third quarter, they're not the type of a team that's going to score quickly enough to like scrap their way back into a game. I just get so worried the way that this roster is constructed. It is not conducive to what worked for Garrett Riley at TCU. And it's just not conducive for explosive enough football to keep up with a team like Miami.
You know, one thing, though, that I would push back on slightly on that, because I'm glad that we lumped this together so it's a little bit more of a brief conversation, is that was Michigan built to be that way either, though? I mean, we've seen teams with different archtypes win in the
Garrett Riley's
physicality
not that,
front,
doesn't run that. He doesn't run that type of a scheme.
But hasn't your main criticism been, though, that they're not allowing Garrett Riley to run his scheme? Isn't that your main criticism of them?
Well, first of all, I have no idea what the hell the offensive approach is, anyways, and that has been my biggest criticism because he's almost put handcuffs on what's supposed to be an aired out offense, which makes no sense to me. But their offensive line is not to the level of Michigan's. It's not.
It's not. No, it's not Michigan's. I would say their defensive line is probably to the level of Michigan's, though. Like it's a very good unit, man. I mean, Peter.
They also
Woods,
have Roman Wilson. What receiver do they have that's comparable to Roman Wilson?
Roman Wilson was. I think Roman
productive.
Wilson was, I think he was a little bit overrated, though. He was good. I don't know.
He was productive, good, though. He put up points.
If you told me Antonio Williams was as good in 2024 as Roman Wilson was in 2023, I'd be like, yep, I can see it. One guy that'll give you you should keep an eye on him, Joe. I don't know how well. I don't know if he's going to break it on the scene in 2024, but they have a freshman wide receiver named TJ Moore from Florida that is quite good. So just a name out there. Second hot take here for me. Michigan, Joe. I know we kind of see them on a similar-ish wavelength. I think Michigan wins 10 games this year. I think they do. Yeah. There is this assumption across the landscape because of the sign stealing scandal that is ongoing and on so many Michigan players going to the NFL that this is going to be a bad Michigan team. And I have been one, and I've written about this at A to Z Sports. I don't think that the formula is going to be the same. I think your ideologies are going to be the same. You're still going to want to be a physical football team. You're still going to be strong up front on both sides of the football. But while you might not have the depth that you've had this past year at Michigan, you have some studs coming back, man. Like, let's not forget Mason Graham is back. Let's not forget Will Johnson is back. Let's not forget that Kenneth Grant is back. Let's not forget that Donovan Edwards, if healthy, is coming back. Let's not forget about your star tight end coming back as well, right? So Michigan might not be as deep as it was this past year, but I do think that they can sustain success because I think that people are kind of underselling the amount of talent that Michigan does have coming back in 2024.
They also don't have as daunting of a schedule, I think, as people realize. I know that they play Texas and you got to play Ohio State again, but for them to finish 10-2, 9-3 is so accomplishable. For them to fall off more than that is not going to happen. And the one thing that everybody leans on is, oh, Alex Orji against a completely new offensive line is going to be a recipe for disaster. I disagree. I think that when he was on Feldman's freak list, he is an unbelievable athlete. So if theoretically he struggles as a passer, I at least know that they're going to find production from the kid as a runner. They literally used him as an almost unstoppable rushing attack last year, and I know that it was in enough spare situations that teams weren't adjusting and able to learn what he was going to do. But when the kid comes in the game and you know, hey, this dude's going to have the football, and you still can't stop him, what do you think is going to happen this upcoming year? I'm not saying a ridiculous production type of a season, but I really think that this offense is going to be more than just capable of beating up on the back end of their schedule and being competitive enough in the close games at the top of the schedule.
Just Google Alex Orji basketball, and there's going to be a clip that comes up, and it is going to showcase how athletic that kid is. I mean, he's up there with the Jalen Milrose, Riley Leonards. Like, he's one of the best athletes at quarterback in college football. So, yes, more respect there. Your second take?
My hot take, and this is getting on the spicy meter, I think that Jalen Milroe can win the Heisman this year. I think that in a season where there isn't really a premier, this is the guy. And like last year, we didn't really have that. We didn't really totally know until Jaden Daniels exploded onto the scene and put up the production that he did. Jalen Milroe will not have Jaden Daniels type production, but he already looked really poised and confident in the spring game, which is a total freaking 180 from what we saw last year. Anyone who watched him, and I kind of compared his demeanor in the pocket to that of Daniel Jones, where he looked really skittish. He looked like he was overthinking things. He didn't handle pressure well. He held on the ball too long. I felt like I was watching a totally different player in the spring game. And I know that that is spring football, but when you see confidence from a young quarterback with a head coach that knows how to develop quarterbacks, the ceiling is so high. That receiver room has received some criticism because of what they've lost, because Jermaine Burton's gone, Isaiah Bond is gone, but we know that Kalen DeBoer is going to find production out of any receiver he's got on the roster.
Ryan Williams, true freshman, keep an eye out.
Was just about to say that he is somebody to pay attention to. So I think that is, it's not super spicy. I think for just the general casual fan who hasn't been like doing any offseason homework is going to listen to me say like, oh, Jalen Milroe stunk last year. Yeah, he was a little tough in some games and didn't play as good as you would have hoped. But this is a completely different situation and one that is built for this young man to flourish. I am all in on Jalen Milroe this year. I think he's going to be great.
No, he showed a lot of growth during the season. I know he didn't have the best game against Michigan, but you know who didn't have the best game against Michigan, Joe? Every other quarterback that played against that Michigan defense, dude. Like, I mean, that was just literally what happened last year. So, last hot takes, okay? Here's mine. And this is probably going to upset some people, which is fine. Ohio State fans tend to not like me that much, okay? I believe Ohio State's going to be a very good team in 2024. It could potentially contend for a national championship. My hot take, Joe, is that Will Howard does not end the season as the starting quarterback for Ohio State.
I disagree with that.
All right, that's fine. Here's my thought process. Ready? Here's my thought process. This quarterback room is the deepest that it has been in several years, with Julian Sayin now in, with Aaron Nolan now in. I'm not a Devin Brown fan, but Devin Brown is still there. And then the kid from South Dakota that started a little bit last year, who's a redshirt freshman, is still there as well. So that's a deep quarterback room. I have seen, Joe, now twice, Will Howard get passed up for a starting spot during his college career. Twice. This has happened twice, okay? He was projected to be a starting quarterback going into 2022. You know what they did? They said, I want to get Adrian Martinez in here to come be the starting quarterback.
He was much more senior, but then Will Howard ended up reclaiming.
He ended up playing well. He ended up playing well that year.
Wasn't he a redshirt freshman?
And then he ended up having a pretty decent year this past year. But you know what happened at the end of this year, Joe? Kansas State said, you might want to find a new school because Avery Johnson's going to be our starting quarterback after this year. I'm just not there.
By the way, that's something that is constantly ignored by Ohio State fans. I bring that up all of the time on Ruffino and Joe, and I have a lot of great Ohio State fans in my comments. For some reason, they hate it when I point that out. They say that that's not what happened. All these other big schools were going after him, and it's just like the same Ohio State fans will tell you that Will Howard was their number one guy they wanted in the transfer portal. BS, absolute BS.
They wanted Cam Ward. They
Yes.
wanted Riley Leonard. They didn't get either. They went to Will Howard. He was not the first option. I think that if Will Howard, because Ohio State's so good this year that I think that if Will Howard isn't playing well for a couple weeks, we're still going to win. I mean, like, they're just that talented of a team. But I do think that there's going to be some pause in the middle of the season where they're like, man, Julian Sayin might be ready, man. Like, he might be ready, and Will's just kind of
okay. This is where you're losing me.
I think that projection could happen.
You're losing me there because I think that Ryan Day has so much on his shoulders, and I think that last year having to throw in a guy to start in Kyle McCord who clearly wasn't ready and couldn't handle the level of pressure that was on his shoulders. As ready as Julian Sayin could look and as blah as Will Howard could be. I'm not a big fan of Will Howard either. I think that he is going to be a slight improvement over Kyle McCord. Just above average enough that he is keeping them on schedule. But even if that happens, it would be so tumultuous for Ryan Day if they don't win a national title and he's doing musical chairs with the quarterback. I think that he is smart enough to know that he needs to stick with whoever it is. And if you're trying to go on a national championship run, a true freshman is just not going to work. I could see maybe like Devin Brown getting into the mix a little bit more, and they should involve him a ton, like Alex Orji. No, but he should be like, but they should do with him what they did with Alex Orji and just bring him in the run. Ability? But at the end of the day, that roster is so freaking loaded that Will Howard just kind of needs to be there, and he doesn't need to make the same stupid mistakes and overthink things the way that Kyle McCord did. I think that he's capable of that. I think that he is going to have a Jake Coker type of a season where he is going to get overhyped and overloved for doing more than he actually did. Just or this isn't a one-on-one comparison. It's going to be just like Stetson Bennett, potentially, where if he hits his ceiling and has his best season, he's going to go to the Heisman ceremony. He's going to. If he plays unbelievable
record and all that type of stuff.
Yes. Yeah. Even if he statistically isn't in the same conversation as some of these other guys, because the team is as good as it is, he'll be the fourth place Heisman Trophy candidate. I can bank on that. All right, here's my quick last one because I know that we don't want to go too long here.
Yes.
Virginia Tech is going to make the playoff. I know that I've got two ACC
playoff.
Okay. This is my like super hot take. This is one I'm throwing out there that I don't think.
And
is
I like Virginia
likely.
Tech, by the way. Go ahead. Yeah.
I think that this is one that might not be particularly likely, but if I'm throwing a dart for something crazy that could happen, I think that one, Virginia Tech goes to the playoff, and two, the Big Ten only sends two schools to the college football playoff this year because they're completely boxed out by the ACC, who sends four. So Clemson, Virginia Tech being the last one outside of Florida State, Miami. This defense is heads above any of the other teams in the ACC. Antoine Powell-Ryland, albeit is not exactly a premier NFL pass rusher, is ridiculously productive. They do have NFL defensive backs in Dorian Strong and Mansour Delane.
Yep.
It all comes down to, can Kyron Jones live up to how some people are painting him to be this offseason? He only threw 3 interceptions last year, and he had a ridiculous end stretch to the season. He rushed for almost 900 yards. I think as they're allowing him to get more comfortable when he already looked comfortable, he could be so great in this conference. For them to finish 10-2 with one upset on their resume in the ACC with a very winnable schedule, I could totally see them being the 11th team. And we're all the SEC fans are screaming and yelling, how did you put them in over Mizzou? How did you let them get in over LSU? Something crazy like that. I think that there is plausibility for them to beat out a 9-3 SEC team or a 9-3 Big Ten team, maybe even a 10-2 Big Ten team.
That'd be wild. I like that one to end it here, folks. That is a hot take.
You tell me you want a hot take. I will come out swinging, brother. I am the hot take machine. If anyone who hasn't tuned in, Ruffino and Joe.
So that is Joe DeLeone, my co-host today on the show. You can follow him on X or on Twitter, however you still call it, JoeDeleone, Joe DeLeone. You can also find him on Ruffino and Joe and the First Team NFL Draft College Football Podcast. Before you get out of here on the Football Room, brought to you by A to Z Sports, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. Make sure if you listen to us on your favorite podcast platform, like and 5-star reviews, and we'll catch you guys in a couple weeks after I'm home from Scotland. Thank y'all.